Good Sunday morning to everyone. This is your friend Joseph Craven with a quick episode of the Weekly Pessimist, the weekly Mississippi State podcast. We had a bye week, of course, or the Bulldogs had a bye week, so I took a bye week. Work busy in my normal life. Figured it'd be a good opportunity to relax a bit, and then maybe put out a slightly late episode where we talk a bit more in detail about the victory over Auburn before heading into the upcoming week where Roe and I will discuss our upcoming matchup a little bit more in detail. So this is the Weekly Pessimist, Mississippi State. We're going to be on ROTC. First things first, let's look at what went well against Auburn, because there was a whole lot that did. Obviously, we, as a team, exposed a lot of Auburn's defensive weaknesses. They had a highly touted defense. Before the season started, I made the comment that Mississippi State and Auburn looked like very, very similar teams, similarly constructed teams. The difference is that while Mississippi State and Auburn returned good quarterbacks, they were fundamentally different quarterbacks. Nick Fitzgerald, Mississippi State, a runner. Jarrett Stidham, a more traditional pocket passing quarterback. Along with that, Mississippi State brings back a stronger run game. Auburn brought back better wide receivers. But defensively speaking, they were both centered around a strong defensive line. And Mississippi State's key to success was being able to avoid that defensive line. If you listen to our full episode last week, Chandler made a very good point that Mississippi State ran the ball to the corners quite a bit, and that was, of course, due to that weird formation that the Bulldogs used a lot, where the running back would line up in the slot, then switch into the backfield on kind of a jet sweep sort of run, outside zone run. And it worked incredibly well. It exposed Auburn's weaknesses at the corners in particular, but also at the linebackers' inability to, cover the outside and be able to cover the middle at the same time. And this is not anything, fundamentally groundbreaking. I mean, this is a spread offense. It's all it is. The spread offense is named as such because it is designed to spread the defense out as far as possible to the corners so that it's never easy to really lock down any particular part of the field. This was just the running aspect of it. Dan Mullen, of course, constructs his offense where you throw a lot of those quick outside bubble screen passes in particular, and then you really run it up the middle. Moorhead took this as an opportunity to run to the outside a lot in order to open up running down the middle. And obviously it worked pretty well, considering Fitzgerald had almost 200 yards rushing. Kylan Hill had 126 yards rushing. Aries Williams didn't see much time on the field because the other two were running so well, but even then he still averaged 6.5 yards a carry to get 32 yards on only 5 attempts. So the running game was designed in such a way to expose Auburn's defensive weaknesses. You avoid that defensive line, you're going to have an opportunity to really do some damage against a team like Auburn. And not only did Mississippi State seem to, obviously defeat Auburn, they seemed to break them. If you look at the way Tennessee was able to defeat Auburn this past weekend, Auburn looked like a defeated team. I believe the saying, or there were people saying before the matchup between the Bulldogs and the Tigers that it was a must-win for both teams. And the fact that Mississippi State got the victory, I think, really demoralized Auburn quite a bit, had them rattled. And they're still trying to recover from that. Mississippi State, it remains to be seen whether or not the must-win carries over, of course, but we'll get to all of that in just a minute. Another thing that went incredibly right was the way that the offensive line handled themselves. Obviously, they had been completely abysmal against both Kentucky and Florida, unable to stop any sort of pass rush in particular. And this is an offensive line that returns 4 starters of an offensive line that statistically was one of the best in the country last season. giving up very, very few sacks whenever Fitzgerald was passing the ball. I mean, it was so bizarre to see them struggle so mightily against the defenses of Kentucky and Florida. Good defenses, especially good pass rushing defenses. And that's the key, because this is an offensive line that is not structured to be a long pass blocking offensive line. They have spent years under John Hevesy learning how to be a great running, rush blocking offensive line. And Moorhead tried too hard to put them into a scheme that they were not ready for. Yes, it's nice to try to get into the Joe Moorhead offense, and moving forward, you're going to have to. There's no way the Mississippi State can continue to win games if all they do is what they did against Auburn. There's no way. You have to transition into the Joe Moorhead offense at some point over time. Moorhead just learning that it couldn't be done instantly, because in particular, the wide receiving core they're not good enough route runners, and the offensive line's not good enough at those extended pass blocking plays in order to give Fitzgerald enough time to make the pass read in those run-pass option plays that the Moorhead offense is structured around. That being said, when the offense was structured the way it was, like it was in this particular matchup against Auburn, then you see the success that it can bring. You see the success that the team had last year. You see what was so good about that offensive line and so good about Fitzgerald, Kylan Hill, Aries Williams. You see what was so good about that rushing attack. And you also see, and this is the most important positive from the game, you see that Moorhead is smart enough to learn and adapt, and humble enough to admit that he needed to. I finally took my coaching pills quip at the end of the game was quite funny in particular. Could be a little bit frustrating when you look at the fact that, first of all, I don't think anything was going to defeat Kentucky. When Mississippi State played Kentucky, there was just nothing. It didn't matter if wide receivers were catching passes, whatever it may be. That was just one of those games where everything was going wrong and Kentucky was doing everything right. I think Kentucky would have beaten just about any team in the country on a night like that. But the Florida game is inexcusable. That's entirely on Moorhead's inability to make adjustments. That's entirely on the offense's inability to have anything resembling production whatsoever. It was inexcusable, and so that was imperative that Moorhead adapt to that, because the Florida game is entirely on Mississippi State. The Florida game is entirely on him as well. Now, obviously, we talked about Florida did do things well. Florida did have a game plan that worked very well to expose what Mississippi State was struggling with, and that was, stopping those little bubble screens and everything. But at the end of the day, probably more so than anything else, Mississippi State's lack of ability to move the ball and lack of ability to protect Fitzgerald from that Todd Grantham pass rush is what cost them the game, more so than Florida flat out beating them. But we've talked about that a lot. In Auburn, in this particular game, you saw the inverse of that. You saw a Mississippi State team that came in with a more prepared game plan and a game plan that played to their strengths much, much more so. You saw offensive line that was asked to make the good zone read rushing blocks in order to open up the outside, to lock down that really big time defensive line, to lock them down so that they didn't get to Nick or Kylan Hill and allow them to get to the outside. Once the defense started to spread out more, Nick able to torch them down the center. I mean, you saw the most important thing that we could possibly have asked out of those two losses to Kentucky and Florida. Can Moorhead learn and adapt? And it seems like he can. Moving forward, it's going to take a whole lot more of that, obviously, because now the question shifts to, can the team learn and adapt to the Moorhead offense? One big-time victory is very nice, but in order to maintain respectability as a program right now, and as this year goes, I mean, you've got to be able to beat Texas A&M. You've got to be able to, put up a big fight against LSU. You've got to be able to show. I mean, this is difficult. It's very, very difficult, and it's worrying that maybe the opportunity is not there just because of this is the difficult part of the schedule for the Bulldogs to make the most out of this season. Well, it is already gone as far as making the most out of it, but I said before the season started, I felt like Mississippi State had the highest floor, lowest ceiling out of all the teams in the SEC in terms of they should be at a certain point if they do things right. And I think that still holds true if the team continues to play the way that they can with the insane talent level. One of maybe the most talented top to bottom Mississippi State team in history, if you really look at it. If they continue to play at that level, then I think it's the same sort of thing. It could be that maybe you have the one more loss to Auburn, but to Alabama, but you're able to win out the other games, and that is about where the ceiling or the floor should have been for the Bulldogs. It's been a weird season in the SEC, and it's not really getting any easier and less strange for Mississippi State. So the players have to now show that they are willing to put in the work to adapt to what Moorhead the point that he wants to take them to. Because that's the biggest question moving forward. How will any of this actually translate? Yes, it's a very good win. Yes, it's impressive to hold Auburn to only 3 field goals. The Auburn offense has not really been good this season. They've shown a lot of weaknesses, especially ones that Mississippi State's defense exploited. But it still was a great performance to hold a team that had been scoring, like 21 points a game, I think, so far in the season, to not even getting a single touchdown, and then getting 2 touchdowns on a defense that didn't allow very many touchdowns up to that point in the season. And let's get a little bit sidetracked right now and talk about the defense just a bit because of what they're able to do and the fact that they are currently the top scoring defense in the country, only allowing about 12.7 points a game. I believe that statistic still holds true. But I will double check it real quick. And yeah, according to the phenomenal website, sportsreference.com, Mississippi State is still the leading scoring defense, the only defense to hold teams to under 13 points a game. And you look at it, Kentucky's defense is still number 4. So that Kentucky game is still a really, really good example of how it just seems like it was going to be impossible to really beat Kentucky when they were hitting on all cylinders like that. Moving forward, Kentucky will probably drop a few more games because that offense is starting to really falter quite a bit, but that's completely beside the point. The Mississippi State defense in this particular matchup, I think, against Auburn is really where they proved that they were more than just a defensive line. It seems like there were a few questions going into the year about, whether the defense was actually more than Montez Sweat, Jeffrey Simmons, and all of that. And there's a lot of names that are popping up that are proving they're a good top-to-bottom defense. Cameron Dantzler, of course, stands out. He's one of the top in the conference in terms of passes defended. He's showing to be a very, very great lockdown cornerback, which is huge. Maybe the best lockdown corner since Jonathan Banks played at Mississippi State. But, Jonathan Abram has been a phenomenal safety so far in the year. He's been playing very, very well. Chauncey Rivers has been the perfect complement on the other side of the line to Montez Sweat, getting a lot of pressure, a great pass rusher right there. Gary Green, as well as that rushing linebacker end type of position, whatever Gary Green is. It's amazing we don't talk more about him considering he has been he's a team captain and stuff, if I remember correctly. So you look at the way the linebackers have stepped up. Between Gary Green, Willie Gay has been, he's been phenomenal. And Errol Thompson, you can't overstate, how good he has been. Third on the team in tackles, 3.5 tackles for loss and 2 sacks as well. Just really impressive numbers out of Thompson as kind of the forgotten guy in the linebacking core of Gary Green, Willie Gay, Leo Lewis, and Thompson. Thompson and Gay in particular have stood out to me as really good, really, really good linebackers. Leo Lewis is 4th on the team in tackles, but I feel like Willie Gay has had more memorable plays, maybe. I don't know. But you look at it and you see that there's more well-rounded performances out there. Jonathan Abram is one in particular that really stands out to me, along with Rivers and Errol Thompson, as three guys that didn't get any respect coming into the year and have really proven themselves to be defensive leaders in a defense that a lot of people thought was probably just Montez Sweat, Jeffrey Simmons, and it's been really refreshing to see. Along with, Braxton Hoyette's been solid in the middle, Brian Cole in whatever position he plays, linebacker, safety, whatever it is, punt return, I don't know. But there's a lot of good stuff to enjoy when it comes to this defense that is, currently the best in the country at not letting teams score. So switching back to the big question moving forward of how much of that will translate. Well, the defense has, in recent weeks, against Kentucky and against Florida, they've shown what happened a lot during the Kroom era of doing everything right and the offense not doing anything, so the defense gets tired. So the key to moving forward is not necessarily to be an offense that scores 60 points a game. It's just to be an offense that moves consistently and can score anything at all. Because against Auburn, it didn't take a bunch of touchdowns to actually win it. It took a touchdown and the ability to consistently move, hit some field goals, and let the defense have time to rest and recover and continue locking down the Auburn offense that was struggling and expose the Auburn offense that was struggling. That's really all it took, and that's all it's really going to take to win a lot of games. If the defense continues playing the way that they're playing, as one of the best defenses in the entire country, not just the conference, but the entire country, then that's always going to keep the team in ball games. And the key is that the offense has to then just move a little bit. And that's what Moorhead has to focus on moving forward, is just figuring out what will keep the offense moving. Even if they're not scoring a touchdown on every single drive, even if they're not becoming one of the best offenses in the entire country, that sort of thing will have to come in the future, because he's still working on building the type of program that he wants to build. He's still playing with a bunch of players that the other guy brought in. So can you do that sort of thing? Can you continue to move the ball against, let's say, a good defense in the LSU Tigers? LSU doesn't exactly give up a lot of points per game. They're in the top 20 in terms of scoring defenses with 16.9 points per game. They don't give up much different rushing statistics than Mississippi State does. Mississippi State only allows about 115 rushing yards a game. LSU only allows 120 rushing yards a game. So very similar type of defensive output here. It might mean that Mississippi State has to complete a few more passes against LSU, but also it might not, because much in the same way that Mississippi State exposed Auburn's defensive issues, Florida exposed LSU's defensive issues. If Auburn can't really defend the outside corners as well, LSU is much weaker in the middle, and in particular on those read options. Heck, Dan Mullen beat LSU last season at Mississippi State by just running really effective read option run plays the entire game. Let's just look at some of the statistics real quick from LSU last season against Mississippi State. It was a big-time 37-7 victory for the Bulldogs. And in that particular game, Aries Williams had 146 rushing yards. Nick Fitzgerald had 88. Nick Gibson even got in on 3 carries for 23 yards, averaging 7.7 yards per rush. So you've got, similar stats, honestly, to what was done against Auburn, just with slightly different names being thrown out there. And when you look at LSU's performance against Florida, well, you start to see something remarkably similar. Florida won that game, of course, 27-19, and in that particular matchup, LaMichael Pirine had 85 rushing yards on 2 touchdowns. Scarlett, 65 yards. Franks, 42 yards. Tony, 25 yards. It was the same sort of offense that beat LSU the year before. LSU's defense has improved, of course, but there's a lot of the same names. They've just gotten a little bit better. But Dan Mullen came out and ran almost the exact same game plan, and it worked. LSU is stronger at defensive back and linebacker than Auburn is. So the outside edges are not going to be open. Just look at what LSU did against Georgia. Georgia, their first drive was pounding it up the middle, running the ball well, gets to the red zone, throws a couple bad passes. Suddenly Georgia could never move the ball again because they got behind, and for whatever reason, they looked at what Florida did. It seems like they looked at what Florida did. I can't say this for certain, obviously, but it looked like they looked at what Florida did and said, no, that's fine, we're going to do our own thing, and then played directly into LSU's strengths for the entire game. LSU is notably stronger at defensive back and stronger at linebacker, it seems, than Auburn is. So the key is to be able to work a read option run so that they don't know whether it's going right outside the line or right inside the line and tricking those linebackers. It worked for Florida. It worked for Mississippi State last year. And Georgia doesn't run that type of thing in their offense. So it just was going to be a matchup nightmare for Georgia either way because they just can't run a read option in a pro-style offense. Florida exposed LSU. The question is whether or not Moorhead's going to be able to implement a game plan that's built around a read option run up the middle that exposes LSU in the same sort of way, or whether LSU's done enough to correct that. That's the biggest question mark with that. Because what worked against Auburn's not going to work against LSU. Same way that what worked against Stephen F. Austin isn't going to work against Kentucky or Florida. You had to change it up against Auburn, and you have to continue changing it up against LSU as well. And that's the question, and that's something that we will address a lot more moving forward. But the good news is there's a game plan that should expose LSU's defensive weaknesses to keep the offense moving. And if the defense continues to be as good as they are for Mississippi State, then it'll keep them in just about every game that they have to play moving forward. Just about. That's going to wrap it up for this episode of the Weekly Pessimist. And chances are there will be a second Weekly Pessimist coming out this week, where Roe and I have a chance to actually talk more about the upcoming matchup. So just be on the lookout for that. But I'm Joseph Craven, and I appreciate you listening to this episode of the Mississippi State-centered Weekly Pessimist here on Running Out the Clock Sports. We'll see you again tomorrow morning with another full episode of ROTC. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Oh, and one final note. If you seriously believe that Keytaon Thompson would have given a better chance of victory against Auburn than Nick Fitzgerald did, then please don't listen to this podcast any longer. I love you, but you were incredibly wrong. Let Nick play.